The night sky over Jerusalem and the West Bank lit up with streaks of fire and the thunder of explosions just hours after a historic ceasefire was announced. On April 8, 2026, Iranian missiles and drones targeted Israeli cities in a direct challenge that tested the fragile two-week pause between the United States and Iran. Interception systems lit up the darkness as defensive fire met incoming projectiles over Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and disputed areas in the West Bank. Israeli media reported that the attacks were expected to continue until the Strait of Hormuz was fully reopened, underscoring the deep fault lines that the deal had failed to close. The ceasefire itself had been hailed as a breakthrough only the night before. President Donald Trump announced the double-sided agreement with Iran just before his self-imposed 8 p.m. Eastern Time deadline on April 7th. Trump stated that, based on conversations with Pakistani leaders, he would suspend U.S. and Israeli strikes on Iranian infrastructure for 2 weeks in exchange for Iran immediately reopening the Strait of Hormuz to safe shipping. The deal was conditional, temporary, and explicitly limited to American and Israeli actions against Iranian targets. Iran's foreign minister quickly confirmed Tehran's commitment to allow safe passage through the vital waterway, which carries roughly 1/5 of global oil and liquefied natural gas. Yet the agreement never included Israel as a formal party. Israeli officials had expressed deep skepticism from the outset, warning that a pause would give Iran time to regroup and reposition assets. The result was a glaring gap in the deal. While the United States and Iran stepped back, Israel remained outside the framework, free to act in self-defense and continue operations against perceived threats. That gap became painfully visible within hours. Iranian forces launched multiple waves of missiles and drones toward Israeli territory. Videos circulating widely showed bright flashes in the night sky as Israel's Iron Dome and other defense systems engaged the incoming threats. Reports confirmed 11 people were injured in the barrage. Israeli media described the strikes as a deliberate signal that Tehran did not consider the ceasefire binding when it came to Israeli targets. Some analysts noted that Iran may have viewed the agreement as applying only to direct U.S. strikes, leaving room for continued pressure on Israel through proxies or direct fire. This rapid escalation exposed the limits of the Islamabad Accord. The deal had been brokered in part through Pakistani mediation, offering both Washington and Tehran a face-saving off-ramp after weeks of intense fighting. Earlier that day, Iranian officials had taken the dramatic step of calling on civilians to form human chains around power plants in anticipation of possible U.S. strikes on critical infrastructure. The images of ordinary Iranians linking arms had become a powerful symbol of national resolve. Now, with missiles flying toward Israel, the human chains appeared to have bought only a temporary reprieve. The economic stakes remained enormous. The effective closure of the Strait of Hormuz in the preceding days had already driven Brent crude prices above $100 per barrel, disrupted global supply chains for fertilizer and helium, and sent stock markets in Europe and Asia lower. The ceasefire announcement had briefly eased those pressures, with oil futures falling sharply on hopes of resumed shipping. But the renewed Iranian attacks on Israel threatened to unravel that fragile optimism. Any perception that the pause was already collapsing could send energy prices surging once again, hitting households worldwide with higher gasoline and heating costs. The Institute for the Study of War and other analysts described the situation as a classic case of incomplete diplomacy. The U.S.-Iran deal addressed the immediate flashpoint, the Strait of Hormuz, but left unresolved the deeper Israeli-Iranian confrontation. Israel had not been consulted as a direct participant, and Iranian hardliners appeared unwilling to extend the pause to actions against the Jewish state. Reports of continued Israeli operations in Lebanon further complicated the picture, illustrating how interconnected the regional conflicts had become. For 6 weeks, the world had watched Operation Epic Fury unfold with devastating intensity. U.S. strikes had hit military targets on Karg Island, the hub responsible for nearly 90% of Iran's oil exports. Israeli aircraft had destroyed railway bridges and logistical nodes across Iran. Iranian missile and drone barrages had targeted Israeli cities and U.S. bases. The human cost had mounted on all sides, with civilian areas increasingly drawn into the fighting. Trump's earlier warning that a whole civilization will die tonight had raised the stakes to an almost existential level. The sudden announcement of a ceasefire had therefore been met with cautious relief across global capitals. Yet the missile attacks on April 8th demonstrated how quickly that relief could evaporate. Communication breakdowns inside Iran may have played a role. Some reports suggested that not all IRGC units received timely word of the agreement. Others argued that the strikes were a deliberate message. Iran would continue to defend its allies and interests regardless of any U.S.-brokered pause. Israeli officials, for their part, made clear that they reserved the right to respond forcefully to any threat. Two broad scenarios now confront decision-makers in the coming days. In the first, the ceasefire holds long enough for diplomatic talks in Islamabad to gain traction. Iran fully reopens the Strait of Hormuz, oil markets stabilize, and both sides use the 2-week window to negotiate broader de-escalation, potentially including sanctions relief and limits on proxy activities. In the second, the attacks on Israel trigger a cycle of retaliation that collapses the pause before it can take root. Israeli strikes resume against Iranian targets. Iran escalates through proxies or direct fire, and the fragile off-ramp disappears, returning the region to open conflict with even higher stakes. What is firmly confirmed from official statements, open-source footage, and reporting: Iran launched missiles and drones toward Israeli territory hours after the U.S.-Iran ceasefire was announced. Interceptions occurred over Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and the West Bank, with injuries reported. The ceasefire agreement between the United States and Iran did not formally include Israel. The Strait of Hormuz remains a central condition of the deal, with Iran committing to safe passage in exchange for the suspension of strikes on its infrastructure. What remains uncertain is whether the ceasefire can survive this early test, how Israel will respond to the attacks, whether Iran's military fully coordinated with its political leadership on the timing of the launches, and whether the diplomatic talks scheduled for Islamabad can overcome the deep mistrust that has defined the conflict for years. The full details of Iran's 10-point plan have not been publicly released in complete form, and interpretations continue to differ between the parties. The images that defined April 8th, the streaks of missiles over Jerusalem, the human chains still standing guard at power plants in Iran, the urgent diplomatic shuttling that produced the ceasefire only to see it challenged within hours, capture the precarious nature of this moment. For the first time in weeks, a path toward de-escalation had appeared. Now that path is under immediate strain. The story unfolding in the skies over Israel and the diplomatic corridors of Islamabad will determine whether this 2-week pause becomes a genuine turning point or merely a brief interlude in a longer and more destructive confrontation. Global energy markets, regional security, and the daily lives of millions hang in the balance as the ceasefire faces its first serious test. The guns have not fallen silent for long. The tankers may soon move again through the Strait of Hormuz, but the missiles launched toward Israel serve as a stark reminder that the underlying conflicts remain unresolved. The world is watching closely to see whether diplomacy or escalation will define the coming days.